Alrighty. Hello everyone, my name is Yara, and today I'm going to be doing the mid-year book freakout tag. This is going to serve as my kind of mid-year check-in to kind of talk about the best and worst and just highlight certain categories of books that I've read so far in the year. This has been a really good reading year for me, not just in the number of books. At this point in July 2025, I've read I think as many books as I read in the entirety of 2024, so that's a win. But also just in the quality of the books that I've been reading, I feel like there's a lot that I really loved this year and new genres and things that I've discovered. Let's tally it up a little bit. So in total, I read 30 books so far, 19 of which were YA, 10 were adult, and 1 was middle grade. There was a whopping 19 of them being fantasy, 4 nonfiction, 3 contemporary, 2 literary fiction, 1 dystopian, and 1 romance. And my average rating so far in the year is 3.88. That is typically my average rating for books in general, so that makes sense. I know this is called the mid-year book freakout tag, but I saw a Clockwork Reader do this and she included movies and TV, and so I was kind of inspired to do the same because I don't really have a space where I talk about movies and TV all that much. To be fair, I don't watch that much movies and TV in comparison to books, but I wanted to highlight some of the ones that I've seen so far. So the first question is, what is the best book that you've read so far in 2025? For me, this has to go to the one book that I rated 5 stars that was not a reread, and that is The Spear Cuts Through Water by Simon Jimenez. This book is kind of hard to describe, even though the plot is kind of deceptively simple. The tagline basically says, 2 warriors shepherd an ancient goddess across a broken land to end the tyrannical reign of a royal family. But the reason I say that it's deceptive is that this is one of the most complicated books that I have ever read in its writing. It is probably the most ambitious and unique book I have read as well. It plays a lot with perspective. We have 3 kinds of perspectives in the book. We have third person omniscient, second person, and even first person. That's written in italics, where we get to see the points of view of like basically every character in the background that would normally just be collateral or auxiliary in the story. It does take some time to get used to. It probably took me like a few attempts to read those first 50 pages before I started to get the hang of the different perspectives and what they mean. But trust me, it is worth it, because once you're kind of following that, it makes the world so much more vibrant. It felt like every single word and decision in the writing was made intentionally, and it made me as a reader much more invested and much more willing to parse out everything going on. And it also just made me appreciate the craft of writing a lot more. I felt very inspired after reading this book. It's a love letter to oral storytelling, to the passing of stories through generations, how the generations before us have affected us. There's also a romance between the 2 main characters that is so very tender and also so just very uniquely presented as well. I just thought this book was stunning. So for movies, admittedly, I have not seen that many movies this year, but one that did really stand out to me and one that I was really excited to see in theaters was Sinners. Again, similar to The Spear Cuts Through Water, it's a movie that made me appreciate the storytelling craft of that medium a lot more. To quote Harry Styles, it was a movie that felt like a movie.
You know, my favorite thing about the movie is like it feels like a movie.
Is a vampire movie that is centered on themes of racism and violence in the 1930s in the US. The music and the score were also stunning, and it's a movie that I would consider to be as close to a musical without being a musical. I mean, there's kind of debate whether it's a musical or not, but I go back and forth. I can see both arguments. I think ultimately it's not a musical, but like structurally and how music was utilized in the storytelling felt very musical-esque. I also want to put an honorable mention to the movie Sing Sing, which came out last year, but I watched it on the plane this year. It's basically about this theater program that is established at a prison. And the story itself is very beautiful. It's about community, learning to lean on others, breaking down emotional barriers and toxic masculinity. But the even cooler part about it to me was that the actors in the movie are actually former people who were in that program at the Sing Sing Correctional Institute. I feel like it's a movie that kind of went under the radar last year, even though it was nominated for Best Picture at the Oscars, so I think it's worth checking out if you're interested. Now for a TV show, this has to go to Attack on Titan for me this year. This show took me through an emotional journey. It basically takes place in a fantasy world. There are these creatures called Titans, which are humanoid, non-intelligent, giant creatures who eat humans. and the only thing protecting humans are these massive walls that have been built. At the beginning of the story, one of these walls is broken into, and Titans lay waste to our main character Aaron's town and murder his mom. After that point, Aaron is determined to join the Army Corps and be part of the forces that are set to destroy all the Titans. I feel like it's really hard to talk about my favorite things about this series without spoiling it, because I do think some of the most interesting things about this show are things that I consider in retrospect after having seen the end. It is definitely a story of, I would consider, delayed gratification, not in the sense that it is bad and you have to trudge through the beginning to get to a meaningful end, more so in that you are constantly being pulled by this question of what are the Titans, where did they come from, and how do we stop them? For like 3 seasons with very marginal hints as to what's going on. Until eventually, the big reveal happens and the story kind of explodes into something new. The series is really great at developing action and suspense and that mystery I mentioned before. You get really attached to the characters in this series, Aaron, Armin, Mikasa, everyone in the Survey Corps. Though my one critique of the show is that I think there could have been a little bit more character work done, especially when it comes to the romance in the series. Though, to be fair, on the other side, it is a story very much centered on survival and just trying to make it through the very next day. And one last thing for the show before I move on is that the score is so beautiful. It is so well done. It is probably one of my favorite scores that I have listened to. And it's probably going to be on my Spotify Wrapped at the end of the year because I've been listening to it so much. Okay, question 2. Oh my god, we're only at question 2. I feel like I've been talking for so long. What has been your favorite sequel of the first half of this year? So I've read a lot of sequels this year. I've read quite a few trilogies, and I'm just like in the middle of a bunch of different series. The Wicked King was really good. Oathbound came out this year. Kind of a sleeper hit was Amari and the Despicable Wonders, 3rd book in the Amari and the Knight Brothers series. But I think this title has to go to the Silver Serpents and the Bronze Beast by Roshani Chokshi because of how much weight they carried as sequels. I reviewed the series in my most recent reads video. It's the one before this one. And I talk about how I had a very weird experience with the trilogy. First book I did not like, gave it 2 stars. But the second and third managed to up my rating and my view of the series so much, and now I view it very positively. I gave the second 2 4 and 4.5 stars respectively. They did a lot of heavy lifting, picking us back up from where book 1 left us. And for that, I feel like it needs some recognition. This is a historical fantasy series starring 5 main characters that kind of begins as more of a heist story and kind of develops into more of this unraveling of the main character and his journey trying to attain an impossible power. The sequels do a really good job of really deepening and developing the character arcs and really making me feel invested in all of these characters. And it actually became quite a heartbreaking and emotional narrative, and one that I got very attached to by the end. Question number 3 is there a new release that you haven't read yet but you're really excited to? I did a pretty good job this year of reading my anticipated releases kind of near the time where they came out. I read Oathbound, I read Sunrise on the Reaping, I read Great But Beautiful Life. But one book that came out that I've not gotten to yet is The River Has Roots by El-Mohtar. This is the same author who wrote, or one of the authors who wrote This Is How You Lose the Time War, which I loved. And to be honest, I have no idea what this book is about besides the fact that I think it's sci-fi. It's fairly short too. Like, I saw it in the bookstore and it was pretty thin. But if it's anything similar to This Is How You Lose the Time War, I know it's going to be a book that I want to take my time with and really absorb the prose. At the risk of sounding pretentious, or maybe a little obvious, I've come to appreciate books that have really great prose. I think The Spear Cuts Through Water really showed me this, how much I enjoy just the actual experience of reading. There by Tommy Orange also gave me that feeling, and I'm currently reading Martyr by Kaveh Akbar, also has really great prose. So I kind of want to use this as my time to like really sink into a book. But a book that has been newly added to my radar that I didn't realize had come out this year is One Day We Will Have Always Been Against This by Omar El-Akkad. The author is an Egyptian-Canadian journalist who had a viral tweet shortly after October 7th, where he said, "One day when it's safe and when there's no personal downside to calling a thing what it is, when it's too late to hold anyone accountable, everyone will have always been against this." The blurb also goes on to say that this book is a reckoning with what it means to live in the West and what it means to live in a world run by a small group of countries, America, the UK, France, and Germany. It draws on the intimate details of Omar's own story as an immigrant who grew up believing in the Western project, who was catapulted into journalism by the rupture of 9/11. This book is his heartsick breakup letter with the West. It is a breakup we are watching all over the US, on college campuses, on city streets, and the consequences of this rupture will be felt by all of us. Everyone that I know who has read this book has said it's phenomenal, that it is insightful and so very timely, and I know it is something that I'm going to want to read. Question number 4 is, what is your most anticipated release of the second half of the year? For books, I'm basic, it's gotta be Katabasis by R.F. Kuang. Admittedly, I'm a little nervous because I think there has been some mixed reviews based off of the arcs that have been sent out already, though I don't think that R.F. Kuang's books are the kinds of books that are like universally liked, if that makes sense. They're pretty academic in nature, so I don't know if they're going to be very enjoyable to everyone's tastes, but still, like, no matter what it is I'm going to be reading it, I'm going to be seeing for myself. I'm actually currently reading The Poppy War because I do want to be more caught up with R.F. Kuang's backlog. Not that The Poppy War is going to have any relation to Katabasis, at least I don't think it will, but we'll see. And the other book that I'm really excited for actually comes out the day that I'm filming this, and it is Sangu Mandanna's new book, A Witch's Guide to Magical Innkeeping. Look, I need a win for the romance. I feel like I've been kind of disappointed with a lot of the romance books that I have read, and so I'm hoping this book will kind of lift me out of the trenches and give me something that I will wholeheartedly be able to love. Because I absolutely loved her first book, The Very Secret Society of Irregular Witches. In terms of movies and TV, the only thing that I'm like actively planning and excited to watch, like something that I will be seated for no matter what, is Wicked Part 2, or Wicked for Good. I thought Wicked Part 1 was so fantastic, I had so much fun, and Defying Gravity literally gave me chills, and if there is anything as close to that in the sequel, then I'm going to be very happy. And I'm also very excited for this because I love Act 2 of Wicked, and I think it kind of made the musical for me, even though at the same time, I think it's kind of flawed. I think it was very rushed. I think the whole musical is kind of rushed. That's why I kind of liked the movie, and that it really gave time for it to breathe. And so I'm super excited to see what they do with the story. I'm excited for the new songs they're gonna add. That'll be interesting. And yes, I will be seated opening night. Thank you very much. Question number 5 is, what is your biggest disappointment so far? For me, disappointment means my expectations did not match the quality and execution of the book. And for that reason, my answer for this is Great Big Beautiful Life by Emily Henry. This is not a bad book at all. It's like competently written, it's fine. It was just very mediocre, and I feel like Emily Henry is so propped up as an author that perhaps I just expect a lot more. A big part of this book is the story of the former celebrity and heiress that the main character is interviewing, which I wasn't opposed to as a general framework for the book. I just think the story itself was not as interesting as maybe it needed to be to occupy that much space in the story. And I was also disappointed in the romance. I've seen people say that this book did not have any romance and that it shouldn't qualify as a romance and that it should qualify only as women's fiction, which I very much disagree with. This is still definitely a romance. I just think the romance was poorly developed. It was very interesting. On the one hand, I would consider this Emily Henry's smuttiest book, but also its least emotionally developed one. I don't know if it's Emily Henry fatigue, but I feel like her main characters and her love interests are starting to meld. I feel like they are starting to have too many similarities that it feels like we're kind of going through a lot of the same emotions. And yeah, I don't think it was giving what it needed to give. The other book that I was really disappointed by is Ruthless Vows by Rebecca Ross. Divine Rivals is hugely popular here and on Book Talk, and I loved it. It was one of my favorite books of last year, I think is when I read it. And again, this is not a bad book per se. It just, I think, really dropped the ball in terms of being a sequel. I feel like the author kind of dug herself into a hole with not establishing enough of the world building in book 1 and then trying to make up for that in this one, but ultimately making it more convoluted and not really making sense. The ending was pretty anticlimactic in my opinion. The romance was still good and it was still beautifully written. I just think it could have been a lot stronger. Question number 6 is, what is your biggest surprise so far this year? And again, I'm kind of say a few titles for this, but for the sake of giving a new answer, I'll say The Cruel Prince. Again, I reviewed that in my most recent video. I go through the whole trilogy as well as the sequel duology, The Stolen Heir, in very in-depth, non-spoiler thoughts if you want to see that. But basically, I went into the series having a very different perception of what it was going to be based off of the online rhetoric about this series than what it actually ended up being, and I was pleasantly surprised with what it ended up being. I really thought that this book was going to be romantasy, that it would lean much more into this enemies to lovers dynamic, and don't get me wrong, it's still very much a part of the story and it's important, but what I personally liked most in the story was the main character Jude and how she was able to carve out this place for herself as a mortal in the fairy world. And so now I'm very glad that I ended up deciding to read it after all of these years of thinking that I would never like it, that I don't like fae stories. Because even with my critiques, I still ended up really enjoying it. And I also like just being able to now participate in conversations when people talk about this series. For a movie that surprised me, that would be K-pop Demon Hunters. This is an animated movie that came out on Netflix that has kind of been popping off recently, especially the soundtrack. And from the title alone, I was not expecting this to be anything. I'm someone who really enjoys cringy media, especially movies and TV. I will watch pretty low quality things if it has certain tropes and I want to be entertained in a certain way. But I was so pleasantly surprised that this movie was actually good. Like, I genuinely think it's a good movie. Could it have expanded a little bit more on its lore? Sure. But I think with the time that it had, it did a really good job. And again, the music is so good, and I've been listening to it nonstop. Question number 7 is, what is a book that made you cry? I always have a hard time answering this question because I don't cry a lot in books. I don't know why. I don't know if that says something about me, but this year, the one that got me pretty close was Amari and the Despicable Wonders, surprisingly enough, the one middle grade book that I read. There was just a moment at the end that really kind of got me, and I was getting a little bit choked up. Sunrise on the Reaping did not make me cry, but did put me in a depressive episode, and I think that should count for something. But TV show definitely goes to Attack on Titan. I was sobbing at the end of this show. And if you want to talk about depressive episodes, this series put me in a depressive episode for like a month. I literally have not been that emotionally devastated by a story in so long, and I've not cried that much for a fictional story in so long. So again, I feel like it needs some type of acknowledgement for that. Question number 8 is a book that made you happy. And for this, I'm going to give it to Dragonfruit by Makiia Lucier and Sorcery of Thorns by Margaret Rogerson. Both of these for kind of the same reason, in that they just felt very classic YA to me, despite being very different and having their own unique qualities. And by classic YA, part of that is that I feel like it was written truly as YA, if that makes sense. I feel like a lot of YA nowadays is trying to target more of an older audience because a lot of YA readers are now older. And so reading these books felt very nostalgic and felt like I was going back to being a teenager. Dragonfruit was really beautiful because it was this kind of quest story. We are searching for a magical dragon's eggs that has the ability to grant people any wish. But more than that, it's a story about homecoming, about being accepted by the people that you came from and feeling like you always have a home to return to. In Sorcery of Thorns, I really liked the dynamic of the romance. It was very much giving kind of like Tangled and Howl's Moving Castle vibes. For movies, I'll give it again to K-pop Demon Hunters because I just love a musical, I love dance sequences, and I love animation. For TV, I'll give it to Overcompensating, which is a comedy made by Benio Skinner that came out a few months ago. I just had a grand old time with this show. I thought it was so funny and the writing was really witty and smartly written. I feel like it's the closest thing that we've gotten to Glee's humor in a long time, which I really appreciated. Right, and the last question number 9, is what books do you want to read by the end of the year? I'm like slightly in a reading slump right now, or I feel it coming on, and so I don't want to put too much pressure on myself to finish certain things. Ideally right now I want to finish my current reads, which are Martyr by Kaveh Akbar and The Poppy War by R.F. Kuang. Hopefully I can finish the whole trilogy. In one of my recent TBR videos, I mentioned that I want to read Sally Rooney's books. If I can read at least one, that would be pretty great. Oh, and I forgot to mention a book that had released that I hadn't gotten to yet was Everything is Tuberculosis by John Green. I bought that book and I do plan on reading it soon. And with all the other books that I'm anticipating for the second half of the year, I feel like that's a good goal. Again, I'm really scared I'm going to enter a reading slump again, so I don't want to put too much pressure on myself. So we'll just see where life takes me in the moment. Alright, so I think that is all the questions. That is the wrap up of my mid-year, the highs and lows and everything in between. I tried to make sure to include some variety in my answers to hopefully portray more of the scope of what I read this year. But of course, there are a lot of books that I read that I didn't really get to talk about today. I have 3 or 4 recent read videos slash book reviews that I've had this year, so if you ever want to hear more of my thoughts about these books, please go check those out and I'll link them down below. You can also follow my Goodreads and my story graph, which will probably be a little bit more updated. So thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you later. Bye.